I can't hear Adrian at all. I don't know.
Yeah. Hi, Adrian. You need to take your mute button off if you want to join us.
Oh, how about that?
That's better. Okay.
I'm unmuted. What I was saying was that there's a button at the bottom of mine which says stop sharing webcam, so I can press that whenever.
Perfect.
Are there other people about? I've just joined because it was going to be on my phone and it said I don't have the supported browser, so I've just I've had to come on to my laptop very quickly.
Okay, Adrian, I'd like to start our session now. So
okay, fine.
So if you disappear, then from the visual side of it, and we can.
Will do.
Okay. Nice meeting you. Thank you.
Okay.
So welcome everybody. Sorry for a slightly late start. It's 10:05, but welcome to this session on concerning the Peddlar of Swaffham, and I'd like to introduce Hugh Lupton, who is a very well-known storyteller who's been working, I would say, basically since the late 1970s, 1990s, where he and a group of other storytellers, in a way, revived a tradition that I would say was at a very fragile point. And that tradition was the a traditional folk story and storytelling as a live experience. And Hugh and a group of others founded something called the Company of Storytellers and built an audience, I would say almost from scratch, to a point where it became, I think in the 1980s and 90s, became an incredibly vibrant culture full of clubs and festivals and events and publications where this particular tradition was in effect brought to life. And the reason that I'm introducing it within the context of the this festival, the Open Publishing Festival, is that there are many overlaps between the world of free software and open source culture and the Creative Commons and this very traditional form of cultural practice. You know, you'd think that these areas would be a world away, but actually there are some very interesting overlaps. And I think one of the principal connections is that they both have a rather idealistic idea of a commons, of a shared culture where every generation of programmers comes in and builds on the the Linuxes and the various open source practices that have been going for decades now, and has a pretty advanced set of protocols which are based on the idea that you can join that culture, you can be part of these open source projects, but whatever you do, you can't close it off again. You can't say, okay, well, now I take it away and I make it a piece of proprietary software, or I make it my story, and no one else can go in there and adapt it. And so there is a very deep connection between these two cultures, which I would say wants to really pull the rug underneath the whole idea of rent and ownership and reintroduce a culture which is based on shared practice and undermining notions of cultural ownership, whilst at the same time making room for individual expression and individual signatures and styles. And that's something that I've always been struck with. Hugh is a very old friend of mine, and we've gone on separate paths. You know, I've been interested in the whole world of computational experimentation and the internet from its early phase, its early utopian phase. And I've watched Hugh develop this whole landscape of storytelling, and I've been fascinated by where the overlaps are. And this festival seemed like an ideal moment to bring it into life, to bring it into existence. So how does that sound to you, Hugh? Does that sound like a fair
Yeah,
representation?
absolutely. Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels. Um, this idea of the commons, of this shared body which belongs to everybody and nobody, and that we inhabit for a while and then we pass on, is critical, certainly to the storytelling world. And I think certainly the early idealistic days of the internet, it was very much a sort of central tenet. So yeah, I think there are parallels.
And just as the that culture became lost, as various predatory organizations have found ways of monetizing our information and our data in what's sometimes called surveillance capitalism, harvesting our information and intervening in our behavior and in our politics. Has anything like that occurred in the storytelling world? Are there predators in the storytelling world in the same way, or do the commonalities end once we've described what we have in common?
Well, I think there's a whole controversy around the question of copyright, and who's entitled to tell what. I think among storytellers, it's a sort of honor among thieves, in that one takes a story which belongs to everybody in a sense, but you make your own form out of it. You have your own line on it. It's a bit like jazz, I suppose. There's the central thread of a narrative, and each teller plays their own variations on it, and those are specific to that teller. So as I say, there's a kind of honor among thieves. You pass a story on, and the idea is that someone takes it and makes it their own. They don't parrot what you've done. They take the central thread of the story and then make their own variations on it. And yeah, that's the way it works. But it all becomes much more complicated when collections are published, and inevitably there becomes a copyright issue when it moves onto the printed page.
Well, that's a very good point for me to bring in this book here, which is one of Hugh's publications. And in this book is a story called The Peddlar of Swaffham.
Yeah.
And when we were discussing this this discussion, we came with the idea, or Hugh came with the idea, that this would be a very good example of a story that exists in many forms around the world. So I think what I'm going to do is basically allow Hugh to take centre stage, turn myself off, and let Hugh tell the story of the Peddlar of Swaffham and introduce it, and we'll come back afterwards for a chat.
Okay. So this is a story that is very specific to a particular place. There's a little town not far from where I live in Norfolk called Swaffham, and this story is told as a true story in Swaffham, and I think the local community identify with it. It's become a sort of marker for that place. So I'd like to tell the story, and then maybe afterwards David and I can have a conversation about its wider provenance. And the story is about a peddler, and his name is John Chapman, and he travelled the highways and the byways of Norfolk many years ago, from Fakenham to Lakenham, from Ludham to Rudham, from Little Snoring to Sea Palling to Wood Dalling, selling his wares mirrors and ribbons and scissors and relics and remedies and ballad sheets, and always with his little dog at his heels, who was as quick after a rat or a rabbit as any dog in Norfolk. But John Chapman was very poor, and he lived in a little cottage on the outskirts of the town of Swaffham, and the place was half open to the weather. In the winter, the winds would be blowing from room to room, and in the summer, the birds would be building their nests in the beams and the rafters above his bed. But John Chapman had one little bit of luck. At the back of the cottage, there was a garden, and in the garden, there was a beautiful old russet apple tree. And every autumn, that tree would drop its fruit onto the grass, as plain on the outside and as sweet on the inside as an old man's memories of love, as the saying goes. Anyway, my story begins. One night, John Chapman, he was lying on his bed, fast asleep, and his dog was curled up at the foot of the bed. And suddenly, in among his dreams, he heard a voice, as clear as moonlight. And the voice said, "Go to London Bridge. Go to London Bridge." John Chapman woke up, and the room was dark, and his dog was snoring, and it was nothing but a dream. And he rolled over and he went back to sleep. The next night, the voice returned, "Go to London Bridge." And John Chapman woke up, and it was nothing but a dream. And night after night after night, the voice returned. And John Chapman started thinking to himself, maybe a man should listen to his dreams. And so he rolled up a blanket, and he put some bread and cheese into a bag, and he hung it from his belt, and he whistled to his dog, and he set off for London Bridge. And it was a great journey. He walked all day, he walked, and that night he slept in a ditch among the dead leaves, and off went his dog after rabbits. And the next day he was walking and trudging, and again it was another ditch. And on the morning of the third day, came to London Bridge, stretching over the River Thames. And in those days, London Bridge was covered in shops. And all the rest of that day, he walked backwards and forwards over the bridge, and nothing happened. And he thought, why did I waste my time listening to dreams? And that night he slept on the embankment under the bridge, and off went his dog after rats. And the next day it was the same thing, backwards and forwards over the bridge, and still nothing happened. And in the middle of the day, his belly was aching and yawning and groaning with hunger, and he was shivering with cold. Every penny had been spent. He sat on a doorstep, and as he was sitting there, the shopkeeper came out and saw him. And he said, "Stranger, what are you doing? All yesterday you were walking backwards and forwards over the bridge, and all this morning, and here you are shivering like a lost soul. What's the matter with you?" And John Chapman said, "Well, I had a dream. And in my dream, I heard a voice as clear as moonlight. And it said, 'Go to London Bridge.' And so I came." The stranger said, "Listen, my friend, you don't want to take any notice of dreams. Last night, I had this ridiculous dream. I dreamed I was in a place, what was it called? Swaffham. And there was a cottage half open to the weather. And at the end of the garden, there was this old apple tree. And there I was in my dream, and I had a spade in my hands. And I was digging among the roots of the apple tree. And do you know, the blade of my spade scraped against the iron lid of a chest. And when I lifted the lid, it was full of gold. But do you think I'm going to cross half England in search of dream gold? Not me. You take my advice, my friend. If I was you..." But he looked, and John Chapman was gone. He was running through the streets of London with his dog at his heels. And he didn't stop running by day or by night until he came home to Swaffham. And he fetched a spade, and he dug among the roots of the old russet apple tree. And sure enough, the blade of the spade scraped against the iron lid of a chest. And when he lifted the lid, sure enough, it was full as a nut with sparkling yellow Roman gold. So John Chapman's peddling days were finished. With the gold he paid for the building of a beautiful house in Swaffham marketplace. He gave money to rebuild Swaffham Church. And if you visit the church, it's got this beautiful wooden hammer beam roof with wooden angels with their wings outstretched, all said to be thanks to John Chapman's gold. And he became famous the length and the breadth of Norfolk, from Fakenham to Lakenham, from Ludham to Rudham, from Little Snoring to Sea Palling to Wood Dawling, as a benefactor to the poor. And when he died, a statue was set up in Swaffham marketplace of John Chapman with his dog at his heels, and set into the gold, set into the stone at the foot of that statue in gold-filled letters were the words, "Even dreams can turn to gold." Even dreams can turn to gold. So the road is long, the journey hard, that leads to gold in your own backyard. And that was the end of that story.
Thank you very much, Hugh.
Thanks, Dave.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, I do see quite a few other people on.
Oh, good.
We're not alone. There's Adam and there's your daughter Alice. I can see.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So there's a few people there. So Hugh,
Yeah.
it's not the only version of that story.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's very much identified with that place as far as that place is concerned. But in fact, it's a universal story. The earliest recorded version was written by Rumi, the Sufi poet and mystic. I think in the 1200s. It turns up in the Arabian Nights. There's a Jewish version called the Prophet Elijah and the Little Shoemaker. There's a Czech version called the Bridge of Prague, I think. It turns up all over Europe. So it's kind of a universal story, and for me it's interesting because I think it's so often the case that the deeper you go into the particular, certainly with folklore, the more it turns out to be universal.
Do you have any sense of who told the story first? Is the provenance, in your sense, is the Arabic or Islamic version earlier? Is the Czech version earlier? Do you have any sense of its journey to Norfolk or from Norfolk?
Absolutely no idea. I mean, as I say, the earliest recorded version is Rumi, but who knows? You know, I think a lot of these stories made journeys along the Silk Route and the trading routes, and it's amazing how these motifs just appear, in some cases all over the world, mysterious as well. And sometimes, you know, you wonder whether they're seeding this isn't in the human imagination rather than some literal historical journey they've made along trade routes.
And your own relationship with the tradition, it always felt to me that there was one particular storyteller who was your guide to the older tradition of storytelling, and that was Duncan Williamson.
Yeah, and yeah. Duncan was a Scottish traveller, born in 1928, and he ran away from home when he was about 13 or 14, and made his living doing odd jobs all over Scotland, and decided when he was very young that he was going to remember every story that he heard, And by the time I knew him, he was an old man with this tremendous repertoire of stories and ballads and jokes and riddles and the whole gamut of the oral tradition. And yeah, I mean, Duncan had a huge influence on me. And one of the traditions among the Scottish travellers is that when you tell a story, the person you heard it from is standing immediately behind you. And I've always loved that idea. The person that person heard it from was standing behind him, and the person that she heard it from was standing behind her. And you get this idea behind the storyteller that there's a line of ghosts stretching back into the shadows. But here you are with those ghosts behind you, and the challenge is for you to tell the story now, in this moment, in a way that speaks to your time. But, you know, in the case of the Peddlar of Swaffham, the ghost behind the ghost behind the ghost behind the ghost behind the ghost might well be, you know, could be anywhere in the world.
It's interesting because it reminds me of Newton's idea when people saw him as the great genius, which he was. He always claimed that his work came from standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think there is a tendency in our era of intense individualism to see everything as needing to be from your own individualized self.
Yeah.
And the best of these traditions, whether it's in, you know, the sort of the free software movement or open source movement or Creative Commons of the kind of the modern age, through to the storytelling time, through to science as it's idealistically interpreted as shared knowledge. There seems to be a kind of a golden thread, which is based on not trying to exclusively own what it is that you are identifying with and which you're articulating.
Yeah, I think the idea of ownership is a relatively recent one. I mean, you know, Shakespeare was drawing his sources from all over the place, and, you know, reworking extant material, quite often traditional material. And, you know, if you look at the cathedrals, or, you know, there's extraordinary carvings and elaborate ceilings. No one claimed ownership. They were sort of the summation of a collective knowledge and skill set. Yeah.
That brings me to this. Which is which is
you're pulling them all out.
I'm here promoting your merch. No, but it is, I think, particularly relevant because John Clare was rather patronizingly known in the Romantic era as the peasant poet. And this is your kind of novelized biography of...
Yeah, it's kind of a year in his life, but yes. Yeah.
And the reason I'm bringing up John Clare is that he was at a very important moment in this subject area that we're discussing, because, of course, the Commons isn't only about common shared culture, it's actually refers to one of the most fundamental factors of our lives, which is the land that we live on, the ground beneath our feet. And something happened in that period of English history that threatened that notion of the shared commons. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and perhaps its relevance to John Clare particularly, and maybe even widen the discussion to storytelling in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, John Clare lived in the early 1800s at a time when the common land, which was the the sort of area between, so slightly outside the farmed agricultural land, there were the commons, which were really a communal resource. People could graze their hogs, they could cut timber, keep their geese, do a bit of hunting. They enabled the landless poor to live. And then at the time of John Clare, in the sort of late 1700s, early 1800s, there was an enclosure movement in which these lands were privatized and allocated to the highest bidder and became part of the kind of the owned farmland. And for the landless poor, who had always depended on them as a sort of subsistence culture, this was a major trauma, and many of them drifted to the cities and became the workforce for the burgeoning industrial revolution. So for John Clare, who was a poet, well, he had a little bit of schooling and became a sort of, well, he was called the peasant poet, but that's demeaning, I think. He was actually a very sophisticated writer in many ways, but steeped in his own place and culture. For him, this loss of the commons was a major trauma. It was as though his own, the land was sort of his muse, and suddenly it was docked and limited, and he felt it almost as a personal, physical attack on his self, on his own self.
And it impacted on his, I mean, what today we would call his mental health, didn't it?
It did, yeah. In fact, I became interested in John Clare after talking to a First Nation, Native American storyteller. And he was saying that when his people were put into reservations, it was as though they were taken out of their mind. Because for that culture, landscape and consciousness are so entwined with one another to be taken out of your place was literally to be taken out of your mind. And I started thinking about the enclosures and about how something very similar happened in English culture with that mass movement from people's native place, and how John Clare in some way was emblematic of that. And he did end up in a lunatic asylum. He was literally taken out of his mind. But yes, I mean, I think the enclosure of the commons becomes an interesting metaphor for the whole notion of copyright and big business moving in on that early idealism of the Creative Commons. It is another form of enclosure, I think.
It's interesting that you mentioned a Native American storyteller, because in a way, I think this brings us on to, if you like, the rather controversial area of what are sometimes called the culture wars.
Yeah.
And let me put something to you, Hugh, which is that when you first began storytelling, the culture wars didn't exist in quite the same form as they exist now. That you felt an enormous freedom to range across the world and look at stories from every continent and feel very free to take those stories and interpret them in your own ways and find audiences for those stories as you began to shape your craft as a storyteller. And I would say probably the same was true for the other members of the company of storytellers and all the other storytellers who were operating at that time. There wasn't the same kind of sensitivity around the ownership of story. How do you feel about that? How have you become more aware of sensitivities around who has the right to tell which story?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's become a tricky area. Yeah, as you say, when we started telling stories, we were very cavalier about telling from any story that appealed to us from any culture that we came across. The more I suppose we started traveling and touring more as well, and working in the States and working in different places, and it has become, and I think it has been for a long time, certainly with the First Nation cultures, quite controversial in that they feel that these stories are very specific to their cultures, that almost everything else has been taken from them, and this is what they still have. And I completely recognize this, and I'm in sympathy, and they feel that we are not entitled to tell those stories. We haven't got the cultural background, the knowledge of place that's integral to them, and we shouldn't be telling them. On the other hand, as someone who's living thousands of miles from that culture, and working quite a lot, for example, in schools, or I have done over the years, I also feel that if I don't tell those stories, nobody's going to hear them. So when I'm working in English schools, I do sometimes tell First Nation stories. I think they're very extraordinary and beautiful stories, and it would be an impoverishment for them not to be shared. But I would never dream of telling them in the States, where you might quite easily be able to bring in a First Nation teller to tell the story from his or her proper perspective. So it's a delicate thing, this ownership question.
Because we began with the Peddlar of Swaffham, and the idea that as this story moves through different cultures, changes and it enriches and it morphs. And the closest, if we kind of make the connection with computational culture, perhaps the most native internet culture of the last 5 or so years has been meme culture, where nobody owns a meme. They change, and the whole point of them is everybody remakes the meme for themselves. And there is this sense that with the storytelling, with the Peddlar of Swaffham, it's not an impoverishment or a theft so much as an enrichment. Or whether it was the the 1960s musicians English musicians who were swept away by the blues, and introduced white America to their own culture, to the black culture, which was being largely ignored by white America. So this notion of
exclusivity, of cultural exclusivity.
There's although it's the political sensitivities are very understandable, and I think it's extremely appropriate that we are always vigilant about those sensitivities, but also recognize that there's a cost.
Yeah, and a good number of those First Nation stories are recognizable story types. You know, I've just been working on a project about the stories associated with the constellations in classical mythology. And I'm struck, there are an awful lot of First Nation stories about the stars and the constellations. And I'm very struck by the parallels and the echoes between the two. And I suspect that a lot of the kind of key forms of traditional stories, because of this passing down and passing down and passing down and passing down, go back into some Paleolithic past. You know, we've always told stories about the stars, and those stories have always been passed and changed and morphed and realigned. But maybe in those classical stories of the stars, these European stories, there is a kind of folk trace of something very, very old, which also is echoed in the First Nation stories. I mean, who knows? We've all been telling stories.
So as we're coming towards the end of our session, what I'd like to ask you about is, if you like, the current state of your area, your craft of storytelling. I mentioned the fact that you and the other storytellers, part of the storytelling revivalists, if you like, had breathed new life into that tradition. What do you see? Do you feel that peaked at a certain point and that there's been a falling off? What do you see as the future of this shared culture of storytelling? Is there a need for a new generation to do a second reinvention? What's the state of the storytelling nation?
Well, I think it's pretty healthy. There's a new generation coming up who are very accomplished storytellers. There are lots of festivals, lots of clubs. It's becoming more mainstream. It's become part of literature festivals and arts festivals. And I think the stories are never. They're always going to find a life in some form or other. And again, I suppose I see my role as being part of this process of taking something and passing it on. But the myths and the folk tales are like templates for human experience, and we bring ourselves to them and look at them almost as though they're mirrors and see ourselves reflected back. So they're never not going to be there. They're irrepressible energy fields, I suppose. And people are going to return to them and return to them and return to them. I don't see it as something that can ever not be there. But the form that it takes is going to be always changing, because I think that the nature of culture, and even most particularly oral culture, is that we're constantly recycling and making these things speak to our moment. So I think it's in a reasonably healthy state, and yeah.
So you don't feel there's some need for a new burst of energy from somewhere? You don't feel it's treading water. You still feel it's moving forward. And if it is moving forward, what are the changes that you see?
I think it's moving forward. I think it's becoming more about performance. I think one of the sadnesses is that I was very, very lucky to catch the tail end of an oral culture. I knew people like Duncan, who had grown up in a culture which was founded entirely on the spoken word and an extraordinary memory, you know, because I think this pre-literate world has a capacity to remember, which is quite boggling to us in our world that depends on the written word in its various forms. So I was very lucky to be rooted in that. I think the generation that follows isn't, and is maybe more concerned with storytelling almost as a form of theatre, which is fine, but maybe loses something at the same time. So I think there's a lot of extraordinary skill, but maybe it's lost its taproot into that more fireside form of storytelling.
How great that we're doing a fireside chat then in the
the right place to be.
Behind, the Victorian fireside behind me.
Yeah.
But there's something about the voice and the body assembling together, isn't there? I mean, I think the loss of the possibility of assembly through this terrible virus is, however good these teleconferencing measures are, telepresence is not the same as being in the same space with other bodies together.
No.
And this brings me to the notion of the assembly and the last the assembly of the severed head, which I think was your last novel, actually.
Yeah.
And maybe we can round off by you just talking about the nature of assembling together, and what this story meant for you, what it's about, and where it sits in relationship to what we've been speaking about till now.
Yeah, well, that book is about the Mabinogion, which is a great cycle of Welsh mythological stories, and it posits it's really about the moment that a set of stories moves from the oral to the written, and it imagines a massacre in a bardic school, and there's one survivor, one old poet, one bard who manages just to survive, and he's brought into a monastery, and under the orders of Llywelyn, the king of Gwynedd at that time, the monks are, one of the monks is told that he must set down these stories on the page, and dictated to by the old bard. It's his last act before he dies. So it's really about that kind of cusp between the oral and the written. And it's also about the act of telling a story, because the old poet says he can't tell a story unless he has an audience. And so the monks have to bring in an audience, and he insists that there's a woman and a child among his listeners, because he can't tell the story just to a bunch of celibate men. And so at the root of the book is this idea that a storyteller is feeding on his listeners, that there's a cyclical, circular thing that goes on between a teller and his audience, and the way that an audience listens and makes pictures in its mind's eye as the teller is speaking actually feeds back to the teller, and that human exchange is at the root of the possibility of storytelling. So yeah, it brings it back to that essentially fireside thing of a community of attention.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to sort of begin to draw our conversation to a close, and this sense of a community of attention and the incredible power when people assemble together, and the need for assemblies, which I feel we really have a sense of what we've lost.
Yeah.
When we lose the right and the power to assemble, and how if we're to not make the mistake of going back to normality, but to use this terrible crisis as a portal to a new age, it will also mean moving beyond systems, moving beyond networks to reinvigorate the assembly. And that's my hope. And for me, the act of coming together and telling stories will be part of that process. Hugh, it's been great pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for the idea.
Yeah, it's great. And I want to thank the Open Publishing Festival and Adam Hyde, who I think was the originator of the idea, but there's a whole group and a team of people, including Boris and Silva, who've helped me technically a lot to make sure that this works properly. Thanks to all of you. And, please email us. And, once I turn off the recording, the system will be in place so that people can continue to ask us questions. And Silva, one of the wonderful members of Cloud 68, the company that has supported us technically with this, has made a terrific, been terrifically supportive, and thanks to them, and of course thanks to you, Hugh. Bye, everyone.